It was supposed to be just another photograph tucked into the archives. A faded black and white snapshot of German workers, their faces set in the stoic rhythm of industry. Rows of men, their hands rough and calloused from toil, stared straight into the lens, unremarkable and ordinary. But something about the man with crossed arms made the historian pause. He wasn't like the others. His posture was too rigid, his expression too knowing, as if the camera had captured not a worker, but a witness to something far darker. At first, it seemed like a trick of shadow, a quirk of old photography. But the longer the photo was studied, the more unsettling details emerged. The man's eyes, sharp and unblinking, appeared to follow you across the room. And in the faint haze around his shoulders, shapes seemed to twist, fleeting forms that vanished when looked at directly. No one knew his name. No records mentioned him. Yet every archive, every old newspaper from that era, whispered of tragedies at the factory. Disappearances, accidents, stories the townsfolk had buried deep. And now, decades later, the photograph had surfaced, daring anyone to look closer. To stare too long was to risk noticing what should not exist. The man with crossed arms was no ordinary figure. He had waited for someone to see him, and someone had. The photograph was supposed to be nothing more than an ordinary piece of history, an artifact buried in a forgotten box at the back of the archive. It had been stacked among dozens of others, yellowed edges curling like fragile leaves, labeled with neat, bureaucratic precision that belied the secrets they might contain. The historian, an older man with a lifetime spent among dusty tomes and brittle documents, had stumbled across it purely by accident, reaching for a folder of factory records that he thought might hold insight into the labor movements of early 20th century Germany. His fingers brushed the smooth, fragile paper, and as he pulled it free, a faint musty scent rose, an almost imperceptible blend of smoke, ink, and the faint tang of decay, like something trapped between the years, waiting to be discovered. He held it gently, turning it over, noting the neat rows of workers standing before a massive, industrial structure whose chimneys loomed into a pale sky. At first glance, they were typical factory workers, their faces set in the blank, stoic expressions that photographers had so often insisted upon at the time. But there was one man who did not belong in that sameness. He stood at the center, arms crossed tightly against his chest, shoulders rigid, his posture unnatural in its perfection. He seemed almost to assert a dominance over the image itself, and the historian felt, inexplicably, a prickle at the back of his neck as his eyes lingered. He examined the photograph under the faint, flickering light of the archive lamp. The edges were frayed, the image grainy. But the details were clear enough to make out the coarse fabrics of work shirts, the smeared faces of soot and oil, the sharp collars that suggested some measure of pride or careful presentation. Yet the man with crossed arms remained immaculately still, unnaturally clean, as if untouched by the grime and labor that marked his companions. There was something in the way his eyes seemed to fix on the camera, a directness that defied the casual nature of group photography. It was as though he had been expecting someone to look, and now, finally, they had. The historian adjusted his magnifying glass, leaning closer, trying to convince himself that it was simply the lens of the old camera, a trick of shadows and light. But the unease lingered. He had seen countless photographs in his career, faces frozen in time, yet rarely had an image seemed to carry an energy, a subtle insistence of presence that reached beyond the paper. Intrigued, he began to research the factory, the workers, and the possible date of the photograph. Old ledgers and employment records revealed names, dates of employment, even instances of minor accidents and reprimands, all catalogued with the dull precision of bureaucratic diligence. But when he attempted to find the man with crossed arms, there was nothing. No record of a worker matching his face, no mention in personnel files, no trace in birth or death records. It was as if he had been erased, deliberately omitted, or perhaps never existed in the first place. The historian's curiosity shifted into something more urgent, a compulsion to understand, to dig deeper into a mystery that defied the normal rules of history. He began photographing the photograph itself, enlarging sections, studying the faint textures and grain patterns, and soon noticed details that had been invisible at first glance. Shadows moved oddly around the man. The light seemed to curve in ways that suggested shapes behind him, blurred but there nonetheless, like echoes of something else hidden in the frame. As he continued his investigation, the photograph seemed to affect him in ways he could not explain. He found himself returning to it again and again, unable to resist the pull of the man's crossed arms, the unblinking stare that seemed to follow him through the room. Other items in the archive faded into the background. Even his own colleagues commented on the obsession growing in his demeanor, the hours he spent hunched over the photograph under flickering fluorescent lights. Each time he looked, it was as though the image shifted imperceptibly, the angles of the man's shoulders or the tilt of his head adjusting in ways that were physically impossible, and yet he could not dismiss it as a trick of perception, because the photograph had never left its frame, had never been altered. Something about the presence captured in that single frozen moment was demanding attention, a subtle insistence that this was not just another image of German workers. It was a message, a warning, or perhaps an invitation. The historian could not decide which, and that uncertainty gnawed at him. Night after night, he returned home, clutching a copy of the photograph, unable to sleep. He placed it on his desk under the faint lamplight, sometimes speaking aloud to himself, questioning whether he had imagined the sense of movement he sometimes glimpsed, or the faint outlines that seemed to hover behind the central figure. Friends and colleagues dismissed his growing unease, attributing it to fatigue or the natural eccentricities of one who had spent decades among relics of the past. But the historian knew something had shifted the moment his fingers first touched the photograph. A subtle, almost imperceptible energy had anchored itself to his awareness, and he could not ignore it. It was no longer just an archival discovery. It was a living puzzle, a fragment of history that refused to remain silent, carrying with it a presence that was patient, watching, waiting to reveal a truth that had been hidden for decades, maybe centuries at first. The historian had thought it was simply an old photograph, another piece of forgotten history waiting to be catalogued and shelved. But as he stared longer at the man with crossed arms, an unease began to creep in, subtle yet persistent, like a shadow shifting at the edge of perception. The longer he looked, the more he noticed that something about the man's presence seemed impossibly deliberate. It was not merely the stiffness of his posture, or the intensity of his gaze. It was the way the light fell across his face, illuminating features that should have been dulled by time and the poor conditions of a factory setting. Unlike the others, whose clothing was smudged with soot and whose expressions bore the fatigue of labor, this man remained immaculate, unmarked, almost as if he had been placed into the photograph rather than photographed with the rest of the workers. The historian traced the outline of his coat, the subtle line of his jaw, and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold, drafty archive room. There was something impossible in the stillness of him, a perfection that was too calculated to be natural, and it made the photograph begin to feel alive in a way that was deeply disorienting. When he first examined the edges of the man, the historian thought it was simply a trick of the old camera lens or the uneven exposure of a print developed long ago. But as he tilted the photograph under the light, subtle anomalies began to emerge. Around the man's shoulders and behind the corners of his crossed arms, faint shadows appeared, shapes that did not belong to any other person in the image. At first they were indistinct, like smudges in charcoal, easy to dismiss as dirt or deterioration over the decades. But with closer inspection, the shapes began to suggest form. Something crouched behind him, perhaps, or pressing close, barely perceptible yet undeniable. The historian's heartbeat quickened as he leaned closer, tracing the shadows with his finger, half expecting the paper to respond, half expecting nothing. And yet the sensation of being watched grew, settling over him like a second skin. It was the kind of presence that could not be ignored, a quiet insistence that something about the photograph demanded attention, demanded recognition. He began comparing the photograph with other images from the same era, taken at similar factories, with groups of workers standing in neat lines, posing for the camera. In all of those, even with their stern expressions and rigid postures, there was a natural uniformity, a sense of ordinary labor frozen in time. But the man with crossed arms was different. He did not belong. Not only did he seem untouchable by the wear of the workday, but his expression carried an edge of knowledge, a preternatural awareness that extended beyond the frame. The historian found that he could not shake the feeling that the man was aware of being observed, aware of those who might later stumble upon his image and recognize him for what he truly was. As the days passed, the historian became increasingly convinced that the photograph was not just a record of a moment in time, but a trap of some kind, a recording designed to hold a presence, and that the man with crossed arms was at the center of it. Late one evening, the historian began to notice changes that made him question his own perception. When he returned to the photograph after hours away, the shadows behind the man seemed sharper, more defined, as though they had been waiting for him to look away, and then had shifted subtly in his absence. The angle of the man's head, imperceptible at first, now appeared slightly tilted, eyes more focused on the observer than they had before. At times, the historian thought he could see a movement of the corner of the man's mouth, the faintest twitch, like a half-smile, meant only for those who dared stare too long. He tried to dismiss it as exhaustion, his mind playing tricks after long hours spent in dim light and solitude. But each glance brought the same unsettling realization. The man was different, and the photograph was no longer passive. It was responding, testing, waiting. As the historian continued his meticulous examination, he discovered anomalies in the environment of the photograph itself. The factory behind the workers seemed to shift slightly each time he studied the image. Brickwork that had been solid now appeared fractured. Windows that were once intact bore dark stains or shadows. And the air above the chimneys seemed thicker, almost smoky in a way that suggested something else had been hidden, something captured unintentionally in the original frame. The historian could not explain why these inconsistencies appeared only when he focused on the man with crossed arms, and he began to feel a creeping suspicion that the photograph contained more than a simple historical record. The shadows, the slight distortions, the faint signs of movement. They hinted at a story the man was keeping, a story that had been hidden in plain sight for decades. Sleep became difficult. The historian would wake in the dead of night, the photograph lying on his desk as if it had been waiting, the figure with crossed arms seeming sharper, in the faint moonlight spilling through his window. He would catch himself imagining the faintest whisper behind the image, a breath of air that was not there, the sense that the man's gaze had followed him from room to room. Friends and colleagues dismissed his growing obsession, remarking on his pale complexion and distracted demeanor. But he could not stop himself from returning to the photograph, adjusting the light, tilting the angle, trying to find some rational explanation for the anomalies he could see with his own eyes. Each discovery, no matter how small, made the image feel more alive, more insistent, until he realized that what had begun as an academic curiosity had become something else entirely, something he could no longer control, something that had been waiting in the shadows of that simple black and white photograph. The historian had initially believed that his unease with the photograph of the factory workers was nothing more than a personal reaction, a fleeting sense of discomfort caused by too many hours spent hunched over dusty papers and fading images. But as he delved deeper into the context surrounding the photograph, a chilling realization began to take shape. What had seemed like a simple, ordinary depiction of laborers was, in fact, a snapshot of a much darker story, a history carefully concealed in records that few had bothered to examine. The factory itself, once a thriving center of industry in the small German town, had been the site of numerous incidents that were rarely mentioned, and those that were recorded were buried under layers of bureaucratic language, sanitized reports, and vague references to accidents or unexplained absences. It was a history that had been meticulously obscured, yet the photograph seemed to carry it all within its frame, encoded in the rigid posture of the man with crossed arms, the way the shadows clung to the edges of the image, and the unsettling energy that emanated from the scene. Archival records revealed that during the period the photograph was taken, a series of mysterious disappearances had plagued the factory. Workers would vanish without explanation, leaving behind tools, unfinished tasks, and the faint trace of footprints that led to nowhere. The local newspapers, when consulted, provided little more than brief mentions of workers gone missing under mysterious circumstances, often attributed to accidents or illness, but the historian sensed a pattern in the dates and the names, an invisible thread linking the events. Each disappearance coincided with a shift in the factory schedule, a new shipment of machinery, or the arrival of an unfamiliar supervisor whose name appeared only fleetingly in payroll records. The man with crossed arms, standing perfectly still in the photograph, seemed to occupy the eye of this storm, a silent witness to something no one had dared to record openly. The historian traveled to the town itself, hoping to uncover more, to speak to descendants of those who had worked at the factory. What he found only deepened the sense of dread. Locals spoke in hushed tones, warning him not to pry too deeply into the past, recounting stories passed down as cautionary tales, half-remembered and heavily edited by fear. Some recalled rumors of a shadowy figure who appeared at the factory whenever accidents occurred, a man who would stand silently, arms crossed, watching the chaos unfold without intervening, and then vanish as mysteriously as he had arrived. Others spoke of strange rituals conducted in the dead of night in the factory basement, rituals meant to protect production or ensure order, though no one could explain exactly what had transpired. Records were vague, contradictory, or deliberately misleading, yet when the historian returned to the photograph, he could not shake the sense that it captured the very center of these events, the man with crossed arms, both observer and participant, frozen in a moment that transcended the ordinary constraints of time and memory. The historian began cross-referencing payroll records, personal letters, and factory maintenance logs. Slowly, a pattern emerged. Several workers who appeared in earlier photographs, smiling and relaxed, would later vanish, their absence noted only in passing footnotes or ledger corrections. There were reports of strange accidents, machinery malfunctions that defied explanation, fires that left no cause, sudden illnesses, and each seemed to occur shortly after the appearance of a man, matching the description of the figure in the photograph. Although the archives provided no official name, witnesses and descendants referred to him in whispers as the overseer who was never listed, a man whose presence was always felt, but never documented. The historian felt a shiver run through him as he realized that the photograph might not merely depict the factory's workforce, but serve as a record of this hidden agent, this enigma at the heart of the calamities that had plagued the factory. Old letters and diaries offered further insight, though much of the content was fragmentary. One entry described a worker who had been warned never to approach the man with crossed arms, who knew things no one else could see and whose gaze carried a weight beyond comprehension. Another letter, unsigned and hastily written, hinted at a series of rituals performed in secret, designed to bind the man to the factory, or perhaps to appease whatever force he represented. The historian felt the air in his study grow colder as he read these words, the shadows of the past pressing in through the faint lamplight. It became increasingly clear that the photograph was no ordinary document. It was a conduit, a trace of events deliberately obscured, and the man at its center was the key to understanding a history that had been carefully erased. Every discovery seemed to reinforce the impossibility of ignoring the figure in the photograph. Historical maps of the town and the factory grounds revealed hidden rooms and sealed-off basements that had been inaccessible for decades, areas where accidents and disappearances were concentrated. Oral histories suggested that workers who entered those spaces often did not return, or if they did, they spoke of seeing a figure standing silently in the shadows, arms crossed, unyielding and watching. The historian began to sense a presence not only in the archival material, but in the very environment surrounding him. Photographs from the era, letters, and official reports all seemed to point to one conclusion. The man with crossed arms had witnessed, if not orchestrated, events that defied explanation, and the weight of his presence had lingered far longer than anyone dared acknowledge. As the historian pieced together the fragments of history, he realized that the photograph was more than a record of workers. It was a puzzle, a warning, and a testament to dark secrets long buried, secrets that now demanded recognition, secrets that the man with crossed arms seemed determined to reveal in his own inscrutable ways. The historian immersed himself deeper into the archives and local histories. The photograph ceased to feel like a simple artifact and began to take on a life of its own. It was no longer just an image, it was a presence, one that seemed to pulse subtly in the dim light of his study. At first, the phenomena were minor, almost imperceptible, a flicker in the corner of his vision when he leaned too close, a sense that the man with crossed arms had shifted slightly, as though the rigid posture he had observed earlier was not entirely fixed. He dismissed it at first, attributing the sensations to exhaustion, poor lighting, and the strain of long hours of research. But the occurrences became more insistent, more difficult to ignore, until he could no longer deny that the photograph itself was behaving in ways that defied natural explanation. It started with the shadows. They had been subtle before. Faint smudges at the edge of the frame, shapes that could be rationalized as imperfections of old printing or accidental exposure during development. But over time, the shadows began to appear more deliberate. They stretched and compressed imperceptibly, forming vague silhouettes that were never the same twice. One night, As the historian studied the photograph, under the yellow glow of his desk lamp, he saw what seemed to be the faint outline of a hand emerging from behind the man's crossed arms, curling upward as if reaching for the edge of the frame. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, convinced that fatigue had tricked him. But when he looked again, the hand, or whatever it was, had vanished. The sensation of being observed, which had been subtle before, now pressed against him insistently, as though the figure in the photograph were aware not only of being looked at, but of who was doing the looking. Soon, other phenomena began to occur. Objects in the room seemed to react in ways that could not be explained. The photograph would fall from its angled support on the desk without warning, landing face down or askew, despite no apparent movement or draft. Paperclips and pencils would roll off the edge, sometimes forming patterns that mimicked the shape of the man's crossed arms. On one occasion, a faint whispering seemed to emanate from the photograph itself, the kind of soft, unintelligible sound that brushes just beneath the threshold of hearing, always vanishing the moment the historian tried to focus on it. The effect was subtle at first, easily dismissed, but over the course of several nights, it grew stronger, sharper, and impossible to ignore. Compelled to investigate, the historian experimented with recording devices, setting up an old reel-to-reel tape recorder beside the photograph. When he played the recording back in the morning, the faintest murmurs could be heard, a soft voice, barely audible, repeating words he could not understand, but which carried a rhythm that suggested intention. The historian's own heart pounded as he listened, because the voice seemed not only aware of him, but deliberate, as though it had anticipated his actions and had been waiting decades for someone to hear it. He tried to rationalize it, blaming interference, equipment malfunction, or ambient noise, yet each time he replayed the tape, the phenomena persisted, sometimes growing clearer, sometimes shifting in tone, but always directed toward him. Even the photograph itself began to distort in ways impossible for ordinary images. When enlarged, the man with crossed arms would sometimes appear to lean slightly forward, subtle shifts in perspective that suggested movement rather than simple optical illusion. At other times, the faint shadows behind him seemed to coalesce into vaguely human shapes, crouching, stretching, retreating, as if they were alive and existed in a dimension layered over the paper. The historian began taking notes obsessively, charting these occurrences, but he quickly realized that recording them only intensified their frequency. Each observation, each measurement, seemed to invite the phenomenon closer, until he felt as though the room itself had become an extension of the photograph, a stage on which the events frozen in the frame were reenacting themselves invisibly. Sleep became erratic. The historian would wake in the night to the sensation of being watched, a weight pressing on his chest, and the faintest flicker of movement across the room. At times, he swore he could hear footsteps approaching the desk, where the photograph lay, soft and deliberate, stopping just behind him, even when the house was empty. One particularly harrowing night, he awoke to the sound of soft breathing in his ears, a rhythmic inhalation that matched the cadence of the man's posture in the photograph. Heart racing, he fumbled for the lamp, only to find the photograph untouched. Yet the shadows behind the central figure had deepened, the faintest outline of a face appearing where none had been before. The historian could not explain it, could not rationalize it, and yet he could not tear his eyes away. As weeks passed, the supernatural phenomena grew bolder. Lights would flicker without warning when he approached the photograph. Doors would click shut in adjacent rooms, and the temperature around the desk would drop suddenly, a cold that seemed to emanate from the image itself. At times, He caught glimpses of the man's expression changing, subtle variations in the eyes or mouth, as though the figure were reacting to him, acknowledging his presence, testing his attention and endurance. He began to fear that prolonged observation might invite something irreversible. Yet the pull of the photograph was irresistible, the need to understand the mystery at its center, overriding every instinct for caution. It was as if the photograph had waited decades for a witness, and now that it had one, it would not allow him to leave untouched by the dark knowledge it contained. The time the historian reached the 5th week of his investigation. He felt as though he had been drawn into a world that existed just beneath the surface of reality, a realm where the ordinary and the inexplicable collided, and where the man with crossed arms was no longer merely a figure in a photograph, but the axis upon which the entire mystery turned. The deeper he delved into archives, diaries, and the fragments of oral history, the clearer it became that the man's presence was not coincidental, that he had not been a worker who had simply posed for the camera and faded into obscurity. He was something else entirely, an entity tied to the factory, to the tragedies and disappearances, to the shadows and whispers that had haunted the historian's nights. And now, the historian realized he was about to uncover the secret that the photograph had been concealing for decades, the truth that had been encoded into every grain, every shadow, every imperceptible distortion. The first breakthrough came when he located a small ledger tucked away in a sealed cabinet labeled only as Confidential Records, 1923-1926. The pages were brittle, handwritten in a script that wavered between precision and haste, and they contained the names of workers, dates of employment, and curious notations in the margins, cryptic phrases like observed or contained, along with symbols the historian did not recognize. As he traced the entries, a pattern emerged. The man with crossed arms appeared in every critical incident, always listed as an overseer or supervisor. Yet there was no corresponding payroll record, no identification, no trace of his existence outside these fleeting annotations. One entry, dated just days before a major accident that had claimed 3 workers, bore a chilling note. The observer watches. No one leaves unnoticed. The historian felt his pulse quicken as the realization settled in. This man had been more than present at these events. He had been integral to them, a fixed point around which misfortune gravitated. Driven by a mixture of fear and curiosity, the historian returned to the photograph for the 100th time, this time armed with ultraviolet light, digital magnification, and the meticulous attention of someone hunting a truth that had eluded generations. As he examined the edges and shadows, he noticed faint inscriptions etched into the frame of the image itself, tiny marks that had been invisible under normal light. They were symbols, arcane, angular, yet unmistakably deliberate, interwoven with the grain of the paper, as if the man's very presence had imprinted itself on the photograph during the moment it was captured. Some of the symbols matched the marginal notes in the ledger, a language of observation, control, and containment. The historian shivered. The man had not simply been a witness. He had been an agent, a living record of an unnatural order, bound to the factory and its events in ways that defied logic, time, and mortality. Then, inexplicably, the photograph began to change. The historian noticed it first as a flicker, a shifting of angles so subtle he questioned his own eyesight. The man's eyes seemed to glint with awareness, narrowing slightly. The faintest movement that could have been imagined, but could not entirely be dismissed. Over the next several nights, the alterations became impossible to ignore. The shadows behind him coalesced into figures that mimicked the workers who had vanished, their outlines writhing faintly as if trapped in the paper, their gazes hollow and accusing. The historian felt an oppressive weight settle over him, a sensation that the room itself had become part of the photograph, that the boundaries between observer and observed were dissolving. And then he understood. The man with crossed arms was no longer simply a human figure. He was a sentinel, a vessel, a curse bound to observe, to endure, and to ensure that the events of the factory could never be forgotten. Though they had been hidden from the world, historical records provided fragments of explanation. The factory had been involved in experimental practices, combining engineering and superstition in ways that were officially dismissed as pseudoscience or rumor. Witnesses mentioned rituals to protect productivity, to enforce discipline, to punish disobedience. But the historian began to piece together a darker truth. The man was the product of such a ritual, or perhaps the architect of it himself, made permanent in that photograph, anchored to the location and the events that unfolded there. The ledger's marginal notes, the cryptic symbols, the vanished workers, all pointed to the man as both observer and enforcer, a being who existed partially outside the normal flow of time, whose gaze could witness generations while never aging, never fading. The historian's own connection to the photograph intensified. He realized that the longer he studied it, the more he became entangled in the man's existence. Subtle phenomena in his home, the flickering lights, the whispers, the shadows that seemed to cling to corners, intensified to the point that he could no longer work without a pervasive sense of surveillance. It was as though the man with crossed arms had recognized him as another witness, another vessel in a chain that stretched decades into the past. And then, in a moment of horrifying clarity, the historian realized the true nature of the curse. The photograph had been waiting, patient for decades, for someone perceptive enough to notice the figure, someone whose attention could activate the latent energy embedded in the image, someone who could finally understand the scale of what the man truly represented.